This all started, as many of you will remember, when BP invited a bunch of independent consultants. They called it leadership development and team development. And some of the people who'd started that then moved over to Barclays, and we actually had this extraordinary privilege of, first of all, getting the opportunity to work with those two companies and all over the world, and secondly, of having the privilege of working with each other. And then subsequently, Mark and I, in 2014, late 2014, we set up Holos. Just to some extent, I mean, to a large extent, to keep us together, because there was the risk that Barclays would stop hiring us or BP would stop hiring us, and we would go our separate ways. So Holos was about keeping the gang together. And we thought we'd get clients quite quickly, but actually it took rather longer than that. But we have got clients, and we are now really delivering kind of what we hope to. We hope to make it bigger. We hope to include more of you. But there's another part to this, which is a big part of the Holos philosophy, is the idea of sustained success. How do we create sustained success? And one of the things that I notice about myself, and I suspect that this might be true for some of you as well, is that I'm not getting younger. And there may come a time when I don't want to do as much of this anymore. And if we're to make Holos sustainable, we've got to create a way of teaching others to do what we do. And particularly teaching younger people to do what we do, even younger than us, even younger than Firas. So in order to create sustained success, for Holos, for us, for any of this stuff, we've got to create a model that recruits new people and inducts new people into the process. And so a little while ago, we tasked Phil and Matt with coming up with a way of teaching what we do, and not teaching at the special bits. What's the magic? Because there's lots of people who do facilitation and training and that sort of thing. But what's the special bit that some of us learned through our work with BP and Barclays, but some of us learned through other ways. What's the bit that makes it special? And so today is our first outing for that. I think is that the first outing, really? Is that right? Yeah. So you are as ever in the experiment of life. You are our guinea pigs for the day, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what it looks like. So over to you. I think Phil, if you on first.
Yes. Thank you, Neil. Hello, everyone. Let me just bring up. You might like to know that future-proof facilitation still has PowerPoint. So let me just bring this up so we can talk about now. What we're going to do in this session is we're going to give you a chance to reflect a bit on what you notice is happening in your world of facilitation, and where you feel you need something new, or you need something different, or things have changed for you. So we're going to give you a bit of time to discuss that, and we'll see what comes out of that. And then we'll share with you what our perspective is on some of the things that are going to make a difference. So we'll say more about that as we go. So let's start with your experience, and Tessa's going to put you into breakouts, and I think I know I said 5 in a group, but I think we'll go for smaller. We can probably get people into 2 groups who are in this room. And a question to you is, so think back over the last year. That's mainly virtual. If you've got face-to-face experiences from before that relate to these questions, by all means bring them in as well. There's no kind of hard rule about the last year. But if you think over your recent experience, what have you experienced that felt like the future? So that you came out of it thinking, I think this is the way things are going, and I don't necessarily feel completely prepared for this. And that's the second bullet. That's your other way into it. When have you facilitated and thought, I don't feel completely comfortable here. I don't feel particularly completely prepared for what it is that I'm dealing with here. So have a discussion, share your thoughts. we'll give you 5 minutes or so, and we don't want a presentation back, but we'd like to have a whole group discussion and see what kind of things have been going on for people and get some fellow feeling. So are people ready for that? Any questions before we put you into group? Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming back. Still, for me, the greatest aid to facilitation that Zoom and its ilk have provided is the moment you say it's time to come back to the main room.
We love it.
Just, I never want to go back to face-to-face personally. Anyway, Neil and Matt, I know you were lurking with a couple of the groups. So I put a burden on you to summarise some of what you heard. Neil, what?
Oh, I wasn't lurking. I was participating.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
No. So if I'm going to summarise our conversation, the only thing that we were uncomfortable about was the initial change. As soon as we got more practiced at it and more used to it, I think we saw lots of advantages, and continue to see lots of advantages. And Mark was just saying at the end, actually, we'd be pretty uncomfortable to go back to hotels and traveling around and, you know, all of that sort of stuff. So I think we're
sheepdog in the coffee area.
Trying
to get people back in the room.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I think, and the other thing that's been energizing and fun is thinking of creative ways to use the technology as well. I mean, I used the example that Matt will be familiar with, which is we've been running full ossuary simulations virtually, and the challenge of, okay, we know this works physically. Now, how do we port it across to a virtual world? And you know, it's pretty chaotic, but then ossuary is, and you know, it works. So now I think it's definitely our future. Whatever the clients think. I think
it probably works better virtually, actually, that one.
Yeah, no, it works really well.
Okay. So specifically around the threat, in inverted commas, of virtual facilitation, it sounds like the conclusion is, if you first of all embrace it, second, move it forward consciously, find ways to make it work for you, so you're the one who owns it and you're the one who's in control.
Absolutely. Yes? Yeah.
And anything that came out of your conversation that wasn't specifically around that kind of big shift, that was around any specific client kind of situations where you might feel a bit more exposed or not sure what was going on?
So certainly when the technology catches you out, there can be moments. Susan had a moment in a big orientation session where I was doing the talking for that particular moment. Susan was the lead facilitator, and her internet went, and she stayed astonishingly calm. And I'm not even sure the client really noticed, but you know, it was a bit of a heart in mouth moment.
I think we had a conversation around, and Matt will sympathise with me with this one because it's what we're battling with at the moment, about restrictions imposed by clients and what technology you can use. And I think, you know, I've got the tension of the one hand of being really excited about what the technology can do, but knowing I'm not up the learning curve in the way that some of you are that are on this call, and how to use it, and certainly not in my comfort zone with it. But the big corporates have a lot of restrictions about what you can use. And MS Teams as a way of doing a lot of this stuff is just not good. And often they don't turn on all the functionality. So I think, you know, we can be really creative, and that, and I, in some ways, feel the creativity that I bring to an in the room event is being stifled because there's a whole lot of boxes being put around it, particularly by some of the big corporates in terms of technology. And it doesn't, I'm sure it doesn't have to be that way. And my question would be, you know, how as facilitators can we help some of those people get more comfortable? Sometimes it's convincing IT departments it's safe, but actually it's about, some of it is about corporate comfort with moving to these new spaces as well.
Thank you, Naomi. Matt, what happened in your group?
I'm actually going to ask Ian to summarise, because I'm going to be talking later, and I'm sure people will welcome hearing a different voice.
Okay, Ian.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, we we raised a number of things. I think once we recognize we're embracing the change to virtual, and initially it was around the types of interventions I think that we all used to deliver, but then how they would work in a virtual platform. So from my own personal point of view, it's around intact senior teams and working with them to build trust over time, and what I would normally do face to face, and could I actually do that virtually? But there's a realization that actually it was really beneficial. People who wouldn't actually open up in the face-to-face environment were opening up. The trust was established quite quickly. There were some experiential activities that still can't be run in the same way. But where I'm finding it now, and where we were talking about it, is the movement towards what has been talked about a long time in terms of blended 70-20-10 solutions, which have been around a long time, but actually a much more careful consideration around where the face-to-face is of value. And one particular program I'm redesigning at the moment, even if it's a global program, people are still willing to travel in the future to come to a shorter face-to-face at the back end of a modular program, where they see you can really share the learning and experiences and successes and challenges. So we talked about that. We talked about also virtual fatigue, creeping in. And being zoomed out almost, people have been quite exhausted with it. And that's going to be quite interesting in terms of how can we make our learning experiences and interventions, virtual ones, different to what they're normally experiencing in their normal corporate environment, whichever systems they're using, because that impact is vital. And Matt, you were sharing one or two ideas. You might come on to this later about what CEOs are doing and around, say, banning virtual meetings on Fridays and things like that. So we had certain senior leaders are taking the lead around actually how do we get the balance right with all of this. I think balance is a key word. I've probably missed some things out there, guys. So Forrest, Matt, please add in what we talked about.
On, Ian.
Okay. Just to say, Firaz's program that he leads for a university in Paris, delivered virtually, was getting higher scores than when he did it in person.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. In terms of engagement, it works really well.
Is it something to do with the backdrop that you use, or?
Mostly, yes. I need to update my Mac because it doesn't allow me to do the backdrops.
No.
But that was one of the things we covered, and they loved playing with the backdrops. Also other things like polling and co-creation on screen and the breakouts and lots of other things, and also drawing and stuff like that we did, which was super fun and super engaging, and they loved all of that. So for them, it kept them engaged throughout the session because you can do so many different things with the technology.
Yeah.
And actually, just building on that, I think the surprise for me was around, best practices always say don't have a virtual session or a module longer than, say, 90 minutes to keep the interaction going, etc. But actually, I've run some quite lengthy virtual sessions, but I've then incorporated all the different technology, and actually they've been really engaged and the time has flown. So I think that could be a myth I've got and a belief I've got to just play with in my head around, actually, you can have longer interactive virtual sessions which are high impact.
Absolutely, yeah. These sessions were half a day to a day long, and the way that you can break it up through the technology and the different sessions, it works quite well.
Yeah, you can certainly have a short deadening session. So by that logic, you can probably have a long, highly invigorating one. Jane, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Ian and Firas has said. It wasn't something that we discussed in our with Neil and Mark, but one of the things that I think that organisations have learned, and certainly from the outside looking in, if there was so let's just say that we had team leaders or supervisors and managers running meetings and they weren't going too well virtually. For me, I felt, well, that's probably because the culture that existed beforehand meant that it's very polarized online and virtually. And that has now come to be the case, is that people have realized that if you're a ship manager, you're a ship manager either virtually or face-to-face. It doesn't make any difference. Yeah. So you're just creating bad karma around you. And actually it's helped, because normally in a meeting, you know, someone can hide, or they can look at the, I was going to say BlackBerry then, but look at their iPhone, you know, underneath the table. But actually here, you can't get away from it. So it's helped managers, I think, to develop their sense of consciousness and leadership, the way that they engage with people. And it's also helped employees and other people to actually be more confident about speaking up, because they're in it's a much more focused thing. So culturally, it's been really interesting. So if somebody says it's not working on Zoom, it's probably because it wasn't working face-to-face anyway. I don't mean with the facilitation, but with the culture of the organisation.
Yeah, no, that's true. Now, we've got to move on in a second, and Naomi's group, I know we haven't heard from. So Naomi, anything to add to the conversation from your discussion?
I was thinking, Susan, the points that you were making about the emotional connection. Did you want to share that? I thought you made that really, really well. Actually, that would be the piece for me, was around that emotional connectivity.
Thanks, Naomi. What I was sharing, folks, was that what I had experienced, and I think what others have as well, is how people are bringing much more of their whole selves to these sessions, not necessarily because they're on technology, but because of where people are today, and encouraging that and embracing that, and giving some examples about something that Matt had put in one of the programs that we're doing for a client, which is a meditation moment at the beginning of the sessions. And it's making such a big difference in people's engagement and how people literally are feeling. And people say this is the best moment of their entire week. I mean, and it's really made these sessions different for people, and it's really made people different. And I credit Matt for that. So hats off to you, my friend.
Oh, thank you.
And I also was saying how, absolutely, I'm getting a little verklempt over this, because it really has been touching for people in these sessions. I also was saying how, you know, in the old days, we used to have somebody have a dog bark if they were taking a call at home, and it was a crisis because all of a sudden they felt like they were not professional, right? And now not only say, oh, we heard the dog, but we want to say, where is the dog, and get the dog on camera, and isn't she cute, right? Yes. And so this whole people,
you Mark. He's got 5 puppies, Susan.
Yeah, but you know, bringing our whole selves to work and modeling that for people, and encouraging them to do the same thing, and wanting to make that part of the future, right? And encouraging that more. And that's something that's really been so welcome, and such a part of, I think, a great change that this working from home has brought to so many of us.
Okay, thank you. Ironically, in a session about facilitation, I'm going through all the classic facilitation things. I know I've got to hand over to Matt in 1 minute, and just at that moment is when everything starts to kick off. So a couple of things. Let me just go with that theme that people bring their whole selves to work. What we're finding, irrespective of whether we're talking about virtually or face-to-face, people's whole selves are a bit more fractured than they used to be in the kind of demands that are being made of them at work. And so as facilitators, that means we've got to encompass a kind of wider range of the unexpected that's going on. And I thought Susan's examples were great. So, you know, if you're open to it and ready for it, then why not? There are kind of 2 things we think that are really going to be helpful to facilitators. If I say in the future, I mean like from now, you know, onwards. One is do we have good enough models of change and leadership and organizational life that are fit for purpose and help leaders navigate the chaos? So in other words, have we got things we can draw on that help us deal with the kind of places that people are now? And then as facilitators, do we have models and ways of facilitating that we can draw on that will also be fit for purpose? So it's those 2 realms. And when Matt and I were looking at how might we help facilitators be more future-proofed, that's where we started. And I'll let Matt take up the story and kind of tell you where we went from there. I think you're going to stick your slide deck on, Matt.
Thank you. And just to say, I think this is, I mean, in terms of the first point about having models of change and organizational life that are fit for purpose, this is where I think a lot of the Holos IP is incredibly helpful, and why it's no surprise that as we went into the pandemic, I mean, Holos has just exploded. I think that's fair to say, Neil. Partly because organizations were realizing a lot of the more conventional thinking about leadership and change weren't fit for purpose. And what Holos was offering was a way of navigating what people were actually experiencing. And certainly in our work with clients, that's what we're finding. You can see people like, oh, thank goodness, people are actually talking about what's happening in my life and world, and not as it was or as it should be. They're talking about the mess and how I navigate it, and they're finding that incredibly valuable. But what we've done is we've distilled, or in terms of that question, which a lot of clients have asked us, is what is it that makes Holos faculty? And by that, I would include a lot of you that even don't work directly for Holos, but have almost walked a similar path. What is it that makes you different? Because often what they're saying is, I want that for my teams, my internal people, but what is it? And can you kind of brand it, and can you offer it to me? And what I'm going to try and do is, and I'm going to draw on a few people here as well, is we've tried to codify what it is that makes us different. And we've also created a program which can help people to develop it, which we've tested. But in terms of what it is, I've been helped by this because we've been working with a client, and as part of that, Mark Thompson watched all of us on the Holos faculty delivering different sessions. So I had a conversation with him and said, what have you seen that makes us different and seems to be delivering really impressive results for the client? Because we're all quite different, we're all in different parts of the world. So based on all of that, we've attempted to codify what it is that makes us distinctive. And let me just pop that up there. Are you, resume share. Are you seeing that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yes.
So I've tried to distill it into 4 elements. And interestingly, it builds on quite a few of the things that we've just been talking about that Phil's led us as we debriefed. So for me, one of the things that I think is critical and increasingly critical is what I'm calling contracting with courage. When you're working with either leadership teams, on leadership programs, whatever the context. And the reason I say that is because what I've noticed from my own work is the very thing that people often need, they try and resist you doing. So often the very thing they need is space, the space for things to emerge, a loose structure, but not overly structured. And my experience is that when you try and propose something like that, I mean, I've had this recently with a leadership team, it's like they want to do everything in 3 hours. And I'm fighting them and saying, no, that, we need some space here. And I'm realizing busyness is a defense that a lot of people are using at the moment, a defense against authentic contact with colleagues, and a defense against the fear that the real issues, which can be messy, might bubble up. And I find it does take courage to fight them to do that. And it's interesting. I mean, just to give you an example of this, I did a kickoff session for a global functional leadership team a couple of weeks ago, as part of a team coaching workshop. And they and I said I wanted to do a check-in and get everyone's voice in the room, and they kind of were arguing with me about that, and I persuaded them just to trust me and do it. And I simply asked them the question, just really light, what's one thing you're grateful for that's happened in the last 7 days? Simple as that. I mean, I wouldn't call that rocket science. And I was looking at the post-workshop feedback, which they insisted on. And over half the people, in response to the question, what was the most valuable part of the 3-hour workshop, said it was hearing more about my colleagues' real lives and what they were grateful for. And it kind of made me chuckle, because I kind of thought, isn't that interesting? If you'd have tried to sell that, you'd have been laughed at. But for them, they said, unprompted, that was the most valuable part of the workshop, over half of them. But they didn't want it to happen. And they would have killed it if they'd have had the chance. In fact, they tried to. So I think this contracting with courage is something that is really important that we've realized in order to create that space. And I suppose one thing I would add to that as well, something I'm increasingly using, and we've baked it into the design of a few Holos programs, is self-managed subgroups, where either as part of the team coaching, they break into subgroups, they're self-managed. It's certainly part of a program that we're running for a client at Holos, and helping them to get set up really well. Because I'm sure you've all had experience where these subgroups, they just very quickly become tepid chat shops, and people are so busy, they end up just not happening because it's not worth it, because I'm just too busy. Which is why in the old days, they would pay us to facilitate them, to make them worthwhile and to help them get into that valuable territory. But of course, often the cost constraints mean that can't happen. So another thing, not just contracting ourselves, but helping groups within programs to also contract really well, is becoming, I think, an increasingly important skill. In fact, I'm running a resilience program for the European leadership team of a international pharmaceutical, and I've set them up into subgroups, taken them through a contracting process, and this client, as with a number of others where I've done this, is saying this is the most valuable part of the program and the work that we're doing, because that's the place where we're getting real authentic contact and able to talk about what's really going on in our worlds. But without the contracting process, which we took them through, they wouldn't have probably got into that space. So I don't think it's just for us, it's for groups we're working with as well. Secondly, managing your own presence and resourcefulness, particularly around triggering. So when either other people in your session get triggered, or when you personally get triggered, having the resourcefulness to actually manage yourself and to stay present is really important. One of the fathers of vertical development is Bill Torbert. You may have heard of his Harvard article called "The 7 Transformations of Leadership." It's one of the top 10 Harvard articles on leadership ever. And he recently updated it, called Warren Buffett and Your 7 Transformations of Leadership. And in there, he talks about one of his PhD students who tracked a number of people going through a Tavistock Institute event, which, if you've ever heard of any of their events, they're designed to trigger people. They're experiential, they're immersive, and they have the explicit intent of triggering you so that you understand better your internal processes and triggers. Anyway, this PhD student was tracking a load of people going through that event, and their hypothesis was people who are more mature on the Bill Torbert vertical development framework will get triggered less. And he was interviewing these people throughout this program. And he was quite disappointed when he found out that irrespective of where you were on that hierarchy, you got triggered just as much as anybody else. But what he subsequently discovered was, through interviews afterwards, he discovered that people at the more mature end of that vertical spectrum had way more developed internal architecture, he called it, or infrastructure, to be able to manage that triggering and to very quickly spot it and to then deal with it and return to center. Whereas he found that people at the more early stages were often triggered for the whole event. They never got back to center until afterwards. And we're realizing at Holos that this ability to be able to manage your own triggering, and when things start kicking off, to actually be able to navigate yourself and to support other people in that is a critical capability. Neil, I wonder if you want to say anything else about that, because I know you've done a lot of work on triggering and having fun doing social experiments with clients, triggering them.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is some of the stuff that we did with Kate, who you may have seen yesterday, if you went to the session that Russell did with her. We had a bunch of clients being repeatedly being lab rats, where we were triggering them and seeing how they responded to it. So the question was always, how do you de-escalate this situation? So there would be some kind of trigger going on. Someone would get escalated. How do you de-escalate it? And I think the thing that was the most often sort of lesson that needed to be repeated was if someone's being emotionally triggered, you can't solve it rationally. You've got to solve the emotional problem first. So if someone is being triggered because they feel isolated, show them they're not isolated. Ask them how you can help them. Show them that you're on their side. And that was it was so often that people would try to de-escalate a situation rationally with data and arguments and logic, and all that would happen is that the escalation would increase, not decrease. And it didn't matter if it was Kate who was pretending, who was acting, or if it was participants who were being triggered. So I think that was the key bit for me.
Thank you, Neil. And just to say, one of the huge challenges that Mark and I talked about is the emotional, I suppose, mastery that is required to work in an interdependent way, which by definition is what we're talking about in that post-conventional space, is significant in the sense of that it requires a vulnerability. It requires the courage to actually deal with issues. And Mark and I, who both co-designed the program that Susan was making reference to, talked very openly about what a hugely challenging process it was for us personally to design something in an interdependent way. And you've poured your heart into something, and then somebody's got a way of improving it, which of course rationally makes sense, but often at the time it can feel quite painful. And everything within you wants to argue and fight and tell somebody why they're wrong. But of course, being able not to allow that to drive the show is challenging. Interestingly, Bill Torbert talks about a challenge, which is, he said, there's a lot of people he's come across that have the language of interdependence, but don't have the practice. And we found this at Holos, is a lot of people talk the game, but in the heat of battle, often get triggered into that very independent space. And that's one of the things that we believe makes us different. Thirdly, and we've talked about this, so I'm not going to say a huge amount about this, but I think having that mastery around designing spaces, whether it's virtual, whether it's in person, that are reflective, that feel safe, that allow issues to breathe, is a critical component of what I suspect you do and what clients value, and certainly what clients tell us. Interestingly, just to build on Susan's point, we ran the first 3 workshops of this particular program that Susan was referring to. And it's brilliant content. I mean, I'm slightly biased because I contributed strongly to the design, but it's brilliant content, it's brilliant design. And at the end of these 3 workshops, which is part of the first compound, I remember asking my group, so what have you most taken or got from these 3 workshops? And over half the people said, the thing I've most got from this is actually having the space to breathe at the beginning. And there was part of me that was really pleased. And there was part of me that was a bit devastated because I thought all of this brilliant content, and what you're saying is actually spending 5 minutes at the beginning, just reconnecting with yourself, is what you valued the most. But I think that's part of this design. And finally, I mean, Phil's talked about this. It's so I don't want to say a lot more about it. I mean, it's continually updating those models of how people and teams change in what we're calling an adaptive context, based on the work of Heifetz, where there's a lot of turbulence. So I'm sure you're doing this, but certainly for me, a lot of the work I'm doing is on getting people just experimenting, carrying out, sort of creating well-formed experiments that can happen, whether it's personally in terms of my own leadership practice, my team, us as a leadership team, getting people to construct mini experiments and then learning from them fast, pivoting, is something that seems to be helping teams and leaders get a lot of traction. So those are the 4 things that we found in response to that question. What makes people like us different is, we believe, is an attempt at codifying the magic. And I completely accept it's not a complete codification, but I think it goes a long way. And it provides some of the elements that we can work on to future-proof ourselves against becoming irrelevant. And I've certainly seen people become irrelevant. But the other piece that clients have been asking us is, okay, how can you help our people develop those capabilities? And we've developed an architecture which we thoroughly tested with a global pharmaceutical, and the answer is yes, we believe we can. We've developed a program architecture which you've got to work really hard not to grow and change if you engage in it, because of the way it's been designed, that embraces a lot of the elements that we've just talked about. So we've developed a facilitator review report where you can, it's basically a diagnostic where you get a fairly thorough assessment of how you stack up against those 4 elements and where you need to focus if you're going to future-proof yourself. And then it starts with, so what I'm talking about here is a program architecture. It starts with an orientation where people get onboarded over a 4-hour period. They debrief the report, they get onboarded to the architecture of the program, they start to meet fellow participants, they start to get their focus sharp. So what often emerges from that is their initial version of their personal facilitator development plan. And then what we take people through is 4 core compounds, which mirror the 4 elements I've just taken you through. Each of those compounds has got 3 events, 2.5-hour virtual sessions, experiential, quite provocative, but also they support people. And those tend to happen in what we call pods, which is a group size, maximum 10 people. So it tends to be quite an intimate space, which helps people to, I guess, to be open and vulnerable. We also give people assignments, so things to do and practice in between sessions. One of the things we were talking about in our group is, increasingly I'm using this metaphor that the way we used to help leaders develop is we give them a load of food and say, okay, here's your food for the next 6 months. And of course, lo and behold, they get indigestion. Whereas of course, what we're doing now is we're giving them a meal every week or 2, which is a lot easier to digest. It's a lot easier to weave into their life. Because I'm sure, like me, you've had these game-changing events that you think are going to change your world that you've attended. Then you go back to your messy, normal life and struggle to integrate it. And 6 months later, you think, how come I've not changed as much as I hoped I would? And this model of little and often, with practice, experimentation, we're finding is a very effective way at helping people to learn and grow. And a lot of clients are saying, even when we can go back, this is better. This is superior as a model of learning and change than the old model. And we also, back to this point about subgroups, we put people into subgroups which are self-managed, and where people are talking about the challenges of changing and growing and future-proofing themselves. We also encourage them to develop a personal change project where they can apply this. So it might be a client assignment, it might be an offer they want to develop, but something where they can put this into practice. We have a closing event, we celebrate learning, we look at endings, we look at how you close things, and this typically lasts, holds people in a space for 4 months. And there's the opportunity. A lot of people say, this is so rich, I don't want this to end, and they continue these self-managed groups. And what we've found is Susan's been running one of these programs using this architecture, myself, Neil, plus others, is it's very difficult not to change. Anything you'd say to that, Susan, based on your experience of taking a group of people through this kind of program?
I agree, Matt. It's a lot of support. It's a lot of reinforcement. And so the structure really, it is really in service of what we're trying to achieve. And I think, again, it was driven really by the need to be virtual. But again, as we know from our experience and speaking with a client, I think this will continue in this structure, even when we go back face to face. And maybe, the orientation event and or the closing event will go face to face just to give people that opportunity, but they will actually stay virtual in these kind of drip feed opportunities weekly because of the benefit they provided.
If you want to find out more, drop us an email, but very happy to take any questions or reactions, observations, challenges you may have.
Yeah, the one thing I was just going to add too is when we talk about building habits, that's really the reinforcer throughout, and that structure also is in service of course, building habits, and that's so well reinforced in the architecture of the program as well.
One of the things we introduce people to at the start of this program is, based on Bill Talbot's work, we've got 10 habits which accelerate the process of vertical development. They're very easy to understand. They're not often easy to do, I mean, that's the whole point of them. They challenge you. But we often will be checking in with people and saying, which of these have you experimented with? And it's quite humbling to hear some of the stories that people experiment with. I'm chuckling. I had one guy who decided to one of them is exploring my relationship to power. And this one guy in a program said, I was in a meeting with my boss, and what he was talking about was bombing so badly, but nobody was saying anything. And I decided, okay, I'm going to consciously help him to pivot in the moment. And he said it scared the crap out of me, because effectively I had to confront this belief I had that I should be submitting to power, hierarchical power. And I was a lot more creative in how I responded. And afterwards, he said my boss was so grateful, and his standing grew significantly in that ecosystem through exploring his relationship to power and confronting a fear.